remember stepping out of the sleek black car, my heels clicking against the marble driveway of the Greenwich estate, my heart fluttering with a mix of excitement and anticipation. I had spent weeks preparing for this gala, carefully selecting a dress that I thought struck the perfect balance between elegance and understated confidence. I imagined the evening unfolding like any other high society event, glasses clinking, laughter echoing, and me standing beside my husband, proud and poised, feeling like we were untouchable together. But from the moment I entered the grand ballroom, that imagined scene shattered into fragments of reality I wasn't prepared for. Across the room, in the golden glow of the chandeliers, he stood arm in arm with her, a woman I barely recognized at first. The millionaire everyone had whispered about, the one whose wealth and status had made her untouchable, was now smiling at him as if they had shared a lifetime together. My stomach dropped, the air thickened, and every word of my rehearsed greeting died on my tongue. The crowd's murmurs became a distant hum, as though time itself had slowed, highlighting the stark contrast between who I had believed my husband to be and the man standing so proudly beside her. I could feel every eye in the room tracing my disbelief, my shock, my humiliation. The laughter, the champagne, the orchestra, it all became background noise to the scene unraveling before me. I wanted to vanish, to escape the betrayal that had become suddenly public. But I forced myself to take slow, controlled breaths, to not let anyone see the quivering anger and heartbreak beneath my composed exterior. The gnawing FOMO settled deep in my chest, a mix of social anxiety and personal loss, and yet a small defiant part of me refused to crumble. I realized, in that moment, that the story of my life was no longer the one I had planned, and if I wanted to reclaim it, I would have to play a different game entirely. My husband's smirk as he greeted their mutual friends, unaware of the storm building inside me, ignited a quiet, simmering rage. I excused myself with a polite nod, stepping into the shadows of the ornate veranda, trying to gather my composure. I felt the weight of everyone's judgment, real or imagined, pressing down. But I also felt a spark of clarity, the first seed of the resolve that would grow into something far beyond heartbreak. The gala, meant to be a celebration of our life together, had become a stage for betrayal, a crucible in which my patience and determination would be tested. And in that suspended moment, the audience, the world around me, saw the beginning of a transformation that would soon shake everything they thought they knew about me, and perhaps about my husband as well. Once I closed the door behind me, the echo of the gala still ringing in my ears, the walls of my home felt suddenly unfamiliar, suffocating and silent. I sank onto the velvet sofa in the living room, the same one my husband and I had picked out together years ago, and let the weight of the night press down on me. I thought of the months I had spent planning, the careful attention to detail, the emotional energy I had poured into every dinner, every gesture, every compromise, and yet it had all counted for nothing. Memories flooded back unbidden. The countless nights I stayed awake helping him with work presentations, the hours I had sacrificed to maintain the household while he chased networking events, the trips I had postponed, the gifts I had secretly bought to support his image, all while keeping my own dreams quietly tucked away. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. No one had noticed, no one had cared, and now he paraded his betrayal like a trophy in front of the very people whose admiration I had once craved. My mind raced through every slight, every dismissive comment, every time my presence had been taken for granted, the countless times I had smiled through irritation and exhaustion just to maintain the illusion of harmony. Anger, humiliation, and a deep, aching sorrow swirled together, and for a moment I could hardly breathe. Yet beneath the hurt, beneath the tears and trembling hands, a small, cold ember of resolve ignited. I would not let this define me. I would not crumble beneath the weight of his arrogance. The thought of quietly accepting defeat felt impossible, even laughable. If he believed that wealth, status, and a glamorous partner could erase the years of my loyalty and effort, he was gravely mistaken. I would reclaim my power, I told myself, and in ways he could never anticipate. The audience, if they were watching, would feel the full spectrum of my emotions, the devastation of betrayal, the moral outrage at the injustice, and the simmering determination that now set my heart ablaze. Every flashback reinforced one undeniable truth. I had given, sacrificed, and loved more than he had ever acknowledged, and now it was time for the scales to tip in my favor. With a deep breath, I rose from the sofa, my mind already cataloging the first steps of a plan, the opening moves of a quiet, inevitable, and utterly satisfying reckoning. I sat at the kitchen island with a single lamp on. The rest of the house plunged into a quiet that felt almost conspiratorial. After the gala, my first practical instinct was not revenge or spectacle. It was numbers. Betrayal hurt, but decaying finances could ruin me in ways that humiliation never could. So I made myself a promise. Before I acted, I would understand exactly what I was up against. I opened the laptop and began the slow, methodical work of taking inventory. The joint accounts were the obvious place to start. I logged into our banking portal and traced transfers, recurring payments, and any unusual withdrawals. There were small entries that revealed a larger pattern. Subscriptions I didn't recognize, concierge fees to services I'd never heard him mention, wire transfers to names that meant nothing to me. My chest tightened at each unfamiliar line item, but the tightening was different from the raw ache of that night. It was focused, useful. Next, I turned to physical records. In the filing cabinet were deeds, share certificates, and paperwork for LLCs whose names made no sense. He had always called himself a modest investor, but those documents told a quieter, truer story. Shell companies nested inside trusts, properties titled under third parties, and an offshore account with balances that suggested careful hiding rather than modesty. Every new paper rearranged the map of what I had thought we owned together. Then I found the spending. Recent statements produced a luxury car lease, a private jet maintenance invoice, and receipts for bespoke jewelry. The scale of his spending felt obscene, not just indulgent but performative. It explained the glittering woman at the gala and his easy conversation with her. He was immersed in a culture where worth was measured in spectacle. Even so, the spending hid something more dangerous. Margin loans and lines of credit secured against businesses I'd believed were solvent. Reputation, I realized, was another currency to count. The whispers at the gala had already started to ripple through mutual circles. I scanned social feeds, invitations, and private group messages, trying to map who would automatically believe his version and who still remembered my quiet competence. Public perception could be weaponized against me. If he framed me as the jealous, unstable spouse, sympathy would dry up. Cataloging allies and likely enemies became as important as cataloging assets. Research became ritual. I registered domain names in my own name, pulled property records across counties, and ordered corporate filings to reveal ownership layers. Some leads fizzled. Others lit up promisingly. An unrecorded transfer between two LLCs, a tax notice filed in another state, a promissory note with handwriting that didn't match his signature. These were small threads, but strong enough to pull. Each revelation tightened the web that tied his finances to his public persona. By 3 a.m, I spread maps and printouts across the table like battle plans. The emotional crushing from the gala had sharpened into a colder calculation. I was no longer the woman who only felt. I was becoming someone who could make facts speak louder than spectacle. The audience watching this slow transition would feel the change. Grief refined into purpose, humiliation recast as strategy. I imagined the moment when the numbers I had unearthed would meet the right pressure points and the scandal would follow. For now, the plan was simple and patient. Gather evidence, secure counsel, and identify leverage. The humiliation had been public. Any reckoning would be louder. I closed the laptop briefly, letting the weight of the evening settle, and felt something steadier than anger. The calm conviction of a person who has finally learned the true value of what she owns and what she is owed. I knew this would not be quick. Patience would be a weapon, timing the hammer. I would align experts, friends, and legal teeth behind the math. When truth surfaced, the gala's laughter would feel hollow, and his carefully curated world would begin to crumble under evidence and public shame. I kept my voice steady when I answered calls, smiling at charity hosts and exchanging polite pleasantries at brunches, but every arrangement I made now had a quieter purpose. Revenge, I told myself, didn't wear a red dress or shout from the rooftops. It moved like a shadow, precise and inevitable. In the days after the gala, I drafted a list. Trusted lawyers, an old mentor who now ran a boutique investment firm, a woman who had once helped with a complicated property transfer, and a few investors who had shown impatience with flashy entrepreneurs. I started with the lawyer I knew I could trust. "I need discretion," I said when I booked the meeting, and he heard the undercurrent immediately. He asked about documents, timelines, and what I was willing to risk. I spoke plainly about the hidden LLCs, the suspicious transfers, and the gaps in our public records. He nodded, taking notes, and told me the steps we could take without alerting my husband. Subpoenas, forensic accounting, and a quiet investigation that would expose structures without fanfare. Next, I reached out to my mentor. Her office was minimalist, the kind of place where confident decisions were made. "I've been thinking about you," she said, and I felt the reunion as a small, steady victory. "I didn't ask for money. I asked for introductions and intel, banks that financed men like my husband, contacts handling trusts, and investors tired of his showmanship." She sent a few names, and the floodgates opened. There was a particular investor, a soft-spoken man who disliked drama, who once muttered that my husband's ventures were smoke and mirrors. Finding him became a quiet obsession. I emailed, then called, and we met for coffee in a place where people pretended not to eavesdrop. "He spends like a man trying to prove he exists," the investor said. And I felt a vindication that had nothing to do with spectacle. He had short positions and access to instruments that could, with timing, apply pressure. I assembled a small team: lawyer, an accountant skilled at peeling back offshore structures, and a financial advisor who understood leverage. We met in rooms my husband would never suspect. In the meetings, I listened more than I spoke. I learned how to convert embarrassment into leverage, how a threatened margin call or a publicized lien could suffocate his social currency. I practiced neutral faces while plans unfurled around me. Outward serenity became a tool. My internal monologue during this time was pragmatic. Patience wins, timing is everything, and leverage multiplies the brave. I remembered how often I had swallowed indignation to preserve appearances. Now I would use those same appearances as camouflage. I rehearsed conversations in my head, imagining how he'd scoff, assume I was harmless, and how that underestimation would topple him. To keep suspicion low, I maintained the routine of a social wife: weekend brunches, charity committees, and curated smiles. But behind that mask, I watched his public moves and subtle financial tells. I scheduled the accountant to monitor transfers, asked the lawyer to quietly request certain records, and nudged the investor to position his bets. Each email and handshake increased the probability that when the moment came, the outcome would favor me. This plan wasn't about ruin for ruin's sake. It was about rewriting a story where I was fodder for someone else's self-aggrandizement. I wanted clarity, exposure that would reshape the social scales. The audience would feel the tension build because I was no longer simply reacting. I was orchestrating. Orchestration, done with patience and precision, turns humiliation into the spectacle reserved for those who deserve it. I pictured the moment facts. Not rumors would erode his smile. Quiet charts, cold legal notices, and boarded-up accounts would replace the gossip. That imagined stillness steadied me, sharpened my appetite for justice, made patience feel powerful and inevitable. When we finally agreed on the first move, a discreet accumulation of leverage that would shift ownership stakes, I felt a calm thrill. The seed had been planted. The first reversal was no longer a thought. It was imminent. I had learned to move like a shadow, and the moment felt exactly like that: quiet, patient, and precise. The company had always been his favorite vanity project, the startup everyone at their table praised while he smiled and took credit. He called it disruptive. He never read the fine print on the capitalization table. He assumed charm would carry the day. He never imagined anyone he had dismissed could outmaneuver him. I started small and anonymous, buying through a shell entity set up with the lawyer's help. It wasn't glamorous work. Hours of online filings, phone calls to brokers, and discreet transfers that left no obvious trail back to me. Each purchase felt like stacking stones for a dam. Alone in my study, I watched numbers accumulate in brokerage accounts. Shares that on paper meant nothing to the casual observer, but in practice could mean everything. I wasn't trying to outspend him. I was trying to outmaneuver. The turning point came at a private reception where he did what he always did best: perform. He stood in a circle of investors and socialites, his laugh loud, his stories rehearsed. He introduced his new partner with the smug pride of a man convinced of his invincibility. I could have stormed the room. Instead, I lingered in the back, feeling the quiet satisfaction of someone who had cultivated leverage under the radar. When the founder mentioned an upcoming vote on preferred share conversion, a few eyebrows rose. My husband scoffed, calling it administrative theater. That dismissal was the moment I had waited for. My lawyer had explained how a conversion could trigger dilution unless holders with a threshold objected. What he treated as trivial could, if flipped, topple his advantage. At the shareholder meeting, the shares I had accumulated, paired with an investor's positions and a few allies, met the threshold needed to call for a conditional vote. The room that had once been his stage now held a different electricity. He walked in with practiced confidence, but the whispering calculations of accountants hummed beneath the polite greetings. When the motion passed, the conversion activated clauses he hadn't budgeted for, dilution of his preferred shares and adjustments that favored holders like me. The smug look drained from his face, replaced by a flush of disbelief. He tried to bargain, spin, charm. Numbers are not persuaded by charm. The satisfaction in the room was subtle, but electric. People who had once applauded him now whispered about miscalculation. I had not sought spectacle. I had engineered accountability. The applause he once soaked in was replaced by cautious congratulations in my direction. I left before gossip could sharpen the edges, but the seed of consequence had been planted. That night, at a dinner where he expected praise, I noticed a new distance in greetings. A tone shifted from indulgent to cautious. He searched the room for validation and found fewer fans. The first twist of karma wasn't a headline. It was a recalibration of social currency. Financial consequences carried permanence. The most telling moment came when his new partner leaned in to congratulate him, and he hesitated, as if the room had lost its script. Her smile flickered. She seemed unsure whether to keep performing. Investors who had laughed now asked practical questions about covenants and cash flow, their interest cooling from romance to diligence. I watched the color drain from his face, an animal panic, then saw him attempt charm that no longer landed. My pulse wasn't from gloating but from clear resolve. All small labors I had done to keep our life afloat, contracts I negotiated, late-night calls to calm vendors, nights I forgave his absence, suddenly mattered as competence and worth. Walking home, I carried the quiet weight of proof. The shares, the votes, the knowledge that the first step had clicked into place. The road ahead would demand patience, but momentum, once absent, now felt inevitable. Indeed. When the next gala invitation arrived, I didn't hesitate. It was hosted by the same circle that once pitied me, whispered about me as the wife who'd been traded up. This time, I wasn't walking into a battlefield. I was stepping onto a stage I quietly owned. I chose a simple black gown, elegant but unassuming, the kind of dress that drew attention by refusing to beg for it. My hair was sleek, my smile measured. Every inch of me radiated composure. When I entered the ballroom, heads turned. It wasn't shock. It was recalibration. The same people who had looked at me with pity now struggled to place me in their hierarchy. I wasn't flaunting anything. No jewels, no forced laughter. I greeted people by name, remembered details about their children, their foundations, their businesses. Influence, I realized, wasn't about noise. It was about memory, timing, and grace. My husband was there, of course. He had always needed to be seen. His new partner shimmered beside him, every inch the stereotype of new money. Diamonds too large, perfume too loud, a dress that seemed designed to demand applause. They entered as if the room owed them admiration. I didn't look away when they approached. I smiled, calm and poised. "Oh, you look lovely," she said, her tone sweet but edged. "Thank you," I replied softly. "It's wonderful to see you both." She tried to brag about their upcoming investment in a tech startup, the same company whose shares I quietly controlled. I let her finish, then said, "That's wonderful. I heard their recent restructuring drew impressive new partners. Her smile faltered just slightly, confusion flickering before she recovered. My husband's jaw tightened. He knew. He understood the subtle weight in my words. That I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was part of the architecture that defined their world. As the evening progressed, the difference between us widened. She chased attention. I attracted it without effort. When I spoke to investors or organizers, people listened, not because I demanded their eyes, but because I offered value, insight, restraint, authenticity. A senator's wife asked for my opinion on a new philanthropy initiative. A hedge fund manager introduced me to his partner with quiet respect. Across the room, my husband's laughter grew louder, almost desperate. I could feel the tension, his need to prove he still belonged, that I hadn't surpassed him. But the hierarchy had shifted, quietly and irrevocably. The contrast was visible to everyone. She sparkled, I glowed. She performed, I commanded presence. When the orchestra began its final waltz, he tried to catch my eye. I offered a polite nod, nothing more. My indifference was louder than any insult. As I left the gala, cameras flashed, and for the first time, they weren't aimed at him. The tension had ripened into power, not the showy kind, but the kind that settles into a room and changes its temperature. This wasn't revenge in spectacle. It was status reclaimed with precision and silence. When I decided to move from quiet leverage to active strategy, I knew I couldn't do it alone. That's when I called 3 people, each with a specific role in what I had begun to think of as the reckoning. First was Daniel, my financial advisor for over a decade. He had watched me sign papers, transfer assets, and smile through my husband's decisions. Over coffee at a quiet cafe in Soho, I finally let the mask drop. I need to know everything, I told him. Every asset he's touched, every company tied to his name, every blind investment. Daniel leaned back, adjusting his glasses. You're planning something, he said, not as a question. I'm planning balance, I replied. He smiled faintly. Then let's begin. Over the next week, Daniel unearthed a map of shell companies and questionable ventures, the ones my husband had funded to impress partners and maintain appearances. Many were bleeding cash. A few, however, held hidden potential. We marked them in red. Those were the arteries I could quietly control. Next, I reached out to Maya, once one of his closest friends, now estranged after he'd cut her out of a business deal. She met me at a small wine bar in Tribeca, cautious but curious. I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again, she said. Neither did I admitted. But I think we have interests that align. Maya smirked. If it's about getting even, you have my attention. She filled me in on his new ventures, the showy investments, the desperate networking, the way he was trying to buy respect faster than he could earn it. Every detail she gave me became another thread in the tapestry of his downfall. Finally, there was Evelyn, my lawyer, my quiet weapon. In her corner office overlooking the river, she spread out documents across the polished mahogany desk. You've been careful, she said approvingly. Every purchase, every move, perfectly legal, beautifully timed. When it all collapses, you'll be untouchable. That's the idea, I said softly. No fireworks. Just gravity doing its work. Evelyn gave a rare smile. You're not after revenge, she said. You're after order. Exactly. Those meetings became the backbone of my transformation, not just emotionally, but strategically. The 3 of them formed a quiet triangle of loyalty and intellect. We met often, sometimes in dim restaurants, sometimes over encrypted calls, each conversation sharpening the plan. Every new discovery, every careful maneuver, brought a pulse of anticipation. I could feel the shift, power gathering, momentum tightening. The audience, if they could see it, would sense the same electricity I did, the thrilling calm before a very personal storm. I was rummaging through an old folder of partnership agreements when I found it. A clause buried in legalese that anybody skimming the papers would have missed. It was the kind of thing accountants and lawyers hide inside parentheticals and footnotes, a conversion trigger tied to a sunset clause and a jurisdictional quirk in the state where the holding company was incorporated. Reading it, I felt the cold thrill of discovery and the heavier pulse of consequence. My first reaction was almost childish joy. Here, in plain but obscure terms, was a lever. If exercised correctly, it could force a revaluation of the asset and create a temporary freeze on certain distributions, precisely the pressure point we needed. But the second reaction was different, a moral tug. Using a technicality to unseat him felt, in a way, like stepping into his own game. I sat back and watched the ceiling, letting the two feelings counterbalance. I called Evelyn first. "I found something," I said, voice steady though my hands trembled. She asked me to email the clause, and then paused, reading it twice before speaking. "It's messy, but it's real," she said. "Jurisdictional timing could give us grounds to file a temporary injunction. It's legally defensible." Hearing her outline the mechanics removed some of the moral fuzziness. Law has rules, and rules are not about spite. They are about correction. Then I spoke to Daniel. He liked puzzles, and this one delighted him. "If we lever this correctly," he said, "we can force a covenant review and trigger margin calls on his leveraged positions. He's been counting on liquidity that would vanish under scrutiny." He sketched scenarios with quick language that made the contours of the plan visible. Who to notify? What evidence to leak discreetly? Which stakeholders to align? Maya, with her history of being burned by him, offered the sharpness I welcomed. "Don't softball this," she said over a clink of ice. "If you're doing it, do it cleanly. He's a showman. He'll try theatrics. We need to be surgical." Her insistence soothed some of my lingering doubt. This wasn't petty. It was precise. The moral dilemma lingered, but each consultation reframed the choice. This was not revenge for revenge's sake. It was holding someone accountable for financial slights that had real victims. The clause was not a trap we had laid. It was a built-in governance mechanism waiting to be enforced. That distinction mattered to me. Afterward, I walked the park to clear my head, imagining the slow unspooling if we activated the clause. I could see the headlines, the whispered meetings, the frantic phone calls. I imagined him pacing, searching for allies, and finding doors slightly ajar instead. The idea of public exposure made my stomach twist, not from schadenfreude, but from the recognition that revelation would hurt many, including people only tangentially involved. I knew we had to be cautious. Timing would be everything. The filing had to precede his liquidity maneuvers but follow enough evidence to be solid. We planned for contingency, prepared statements, selective disclosures, and a legal narrative that emphasized governance rather than vendetta. The plan felt cleaner when framed as correction rather than spectacle. At dusk, the city felt smaller and more intimate, as if it were rehearsing for the moment we would trigger the clause. I tucked the photocopy back into the folder and closed it with a fold. The lever was real. Choice to pull it would be mine. And when I did, the consequences would be loud. He began to wear his wealth like armor, announcing success with every carefully curated post and public toast. After the shareholder motion, he doubled down on performance. Larger donations, louder stories, and a steady parade of photographed excess. Each display was a data point. He wanted the room to forget the math we had quietly introduced. He wanted attention to drown out accountability. Instead, his spectacle became a timeline I could read. At an upscale charity dinner, he climbed the podium and told a familiar tale of sacrifice and reward, punctuating it with a wink aimed at mutual acquaintances. People applauded. I felt the applause like a physical press against old wounds, but beneath the ache, I felt clarity. Performance revealed patterns, timing of transfers, predictable liquidity windows, the friends who answered every phone call. His bravado had sharpened my aim. He mocked me privately in small ways. A text with a laughing emoji about drama. An exaggerated voice message retelling my tears as melodrama. A casual aside at a party that he'd upgraded. The cruelty was habitual, almost comic, but it underscored his belief that social theater could rewrite truth. Those little slights hardened my resolve. They were talismans of underestimation I intended to shatter. I called a meeting with Daniel, Evelyn, and Maya. The plan needed to be surgical and airtight. I outlined the goal plainly. Forced negotiation by constricting his liquidity and exposing structural weaknesses. Daniel proposed tightening covenants and timing notices to coincide with projected cash movements. Evelyn recommended carefully worded filings that framed our actions as governance, not vendetta. Maya offered to whisper confirmations to select investors who trusted her judgment. We spent hours modeling scenarios until the contours of consequence were visible. Our strategy had 3 prongs. First, stiffen covenant enforcement on companies where he had personal guarantees, creating the possibility of margin calls. Second, place liens on properties tied to the network of LLCs we had traced, reducing his collateral runway. Third, feed precise, verifiable information to investors who would quickly demand transparency. Each move alone would bruise him. Together, they could make negotiation the most appealing option. I wrestled with the moral gravity of it. There was a part of me that recoiled at staging someone's public humiliation. He was the father of my child once, a man I had believed in. But the intellectual honesty of our legal grounds eased the unease. This was not theater for spectacle. It was an enforcement of rules that had always existed and had been ignored. He had weaponized performance. It was time to make performance answerable to facts. Public optics mattered. Evelyn drafted statements that emphasized fiduciary responsibility and creditor protection. We planned the releases so the narrative would center governance rather than grudge. Daniel calibrated the timing, so notices landed immediately after his next scheduled liquidity move, increasing the chance of a cascade. Maya lined up subtle confirmations at the right tables, so questions would surface organically among his social circle. In private, I practiced my face for these moments, calm, measured, almost indifferent. I rehearsed brief replies that suggested steadiness rather than triumph. His friends would watch my demeanor and wonder at my composure. Their uncertainty would become another lever. When he posted his next acquisition, I felt the throttle pull. The notices were ready, the calls queued. The night before execution, I sat on the living room floor surrounded by the maps and filings we'd assembled. The city hummed beyond the windows. A low guilt tugged at me, but beneath it was a fierce clarity. Accountability was overdue. He had used spectacle to hide risk. Now numbers would speak louder than champagne. In the morning, the first notice would land, and the room he sought to command would start asking different questions. The suspense was sharp, and the outrage it would produce felt almost necessary. The moment of exposure would not erase the past, but it would force reckoning. I pictured him pacing hotel suites, calling allies, realizing applause could no longer buy immunity. That image steadied me. I went to bed with a plan and a strange calm, the kind that comes before a necessary storm. The day everything shifted began with an ordinary email that was anything but ordinary. I woke to a message from Daniel. The covenant notice had been accepted by 2 major lenders, and an automatic review had been triggered. My stomach dropped, but it was the kind of drop that belonged to timing and consequence, not panic. We had designed the move to be precise. Now the machinery we had put in motion was working. By mid-morning, Evelyn informed me she had filed for a temporary injunction that would freeze certain distributions pending a forensic review. It was a legal chokehold dressed as procedure. He'd built his life on fluid collateral and easy credit. Freezing payouts would force immediate liquidity questions. I watched the timestamps of filings, the careful choreography of notices and responses, and felt a tight, satisfying symmetry. This was accountability moving through systems he assumed would protect him. That afternoon, as he posted another triumphant photo from a yacht weekend, investor groups started asking for clarifications. Daniel had quietly arranged calls with 3 institutional partners, and their questions were sharp and public enough to be noticed by networks that covered business socialites. The leverage we had bought in shares now translated into votes and voices that mattered. When the board agenda was updated to include an emergency covenant review, his new partner messaged me with confusion I barely hid. The real pivot came during the board meeting. He entered with practiced bravado, a smile that once charmed lawyers and donors. He left with a face edged by disbelief. The emergency resolution passed. A restructuring committee was empowered, and certain executive privileges were suspended pending audit. The clause we'd unearthed, the shares I had accumulated, and institutional pressure combined to recalibrate authority. It was a quiet coup, procedural and devastating. Outside, in the lobby, whispers moved faster than any crafted statement. His ally, a hedge fund manager who had toasted him weeks before, avoided eye contact. Investors who'd once laughed at our dinner table now asked practical questions about cash flow and covenants. He made calls, attempted charm, promised transparency, but the cadence had changed. People listened as if deciphering risk. He tried to spin it into a minor hiccup. Messages to mutual friends insisted everything was under control, but notices from lawyers and lenders carried a sterner tone. A financial correspondent who'd once written puff pieces about his charisma now sent a terse inquiry about the committee's formation. That evening, when we met for dinner, his voice had the brittle edge of someone groping for footing. He asked me what I intended, and I said nothing. My silence was a message. The public consequences accelerated when one of his leveraged positions triggered a margin call. Daniel had timed disclosures to coincide with his cash flows. The cascade began. Assets tied to his name were temporarily restricted, transfers held up, and creditors demanded immediate reconciliations. Social invitations dwindled. The woman who'd been his newest accessory posted less beside him. Her captions grew cautious. The gilded world that had protected him evaporated into sober meetings and subpoenas. I felt vindication, tempered by an odd melancholy. This was correction, not cruelty, but correction laid bare fragility beneath performance. Not only his, but of a social ecosystem that prized form over substance. Later that night, mutual acquaintances spoke in hushed tones, acknowledging the shift without celebration. It wasn't gleeful victory. It was a reckoning. Walking home, I clutched my coat as if to hold a new geometry under my feet. The balance of power had cracked with efficient breaks rather than an explosive collapse, yet those breaks mattered. Where he had been untouchable, now there were entry points. I hadn't sought to humiliate. I had sought to restore order. The board's vote had done both. For anyone watching, the satisfaction came from consequence done cleanly, inevitable, measured, and irreversible. In the weeks that followed, conversations shifted from admiration to cautious appraisal. Invitations thinned, deposits were questioned, and his name no longer opened doors as it once had. I felt the slow, steady work of dismantling a house of cards. Truly. It happened at a charity gala, an event meant to restore his image after the financial turbulence he was desperately trying to downplay. The venue gleamed with chandeliers and floral excess, the sort of ostentation he adored. I had not planned to attend, but an unexpected invitation, slipped through a mutual contact, felt too poetic to ignore. Evelyn had smiled when I told her. "Sometimes," she said, "gravity does the work for you." He stood at the center of the ballroom, surrounded by cameras and reporters. His new partner clung to his arm, her gown shimmering like a shield. Laughter, champagne, and the hollow murmur of networking filled the air. When he noticed me near the bar, a flicker of something crossed his face, discomfort masked as disdain. He raised his glass in a mocking salute. "Still haunting my events, darling," he said loudly enough for others to hear. A few polite chuckles followed. I smiled faintly. "Just attending the show," I replied. Minutes later, a journalist from a financial paper approached the podium to announce an award for philanthropic excellence. My husband's name was among the honorees. He stepped forward, basking in the glow of attention, rehearsed charm on full display. Cameras flashed. He began his speech with the practiced arrogance of a man who still believed he controlled the narrative. "Integrity and innovation," he said, "are the twin pillars of success." The irony would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Then came the interruption. A reporter, young, confident, unafraid, stood and asked, "Mr. Reynolds, can you comment on the ongoing investigation into your company's asset mismanagement?" The question sliced through the air. The music stopped. A collective inhale rippled through the room. His smile faltered. "I'm not aware of any such investigation," he said, voice tight. The reporter pressed. "Sources confirm a restructuring committee has frozen multiple accounts pending review. Investors are alleging you diverted company funds to personal ventures, including private properties and luxury assets." Gasps followed. Phones lit up as people began searching the news. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. I had known this was coming, but not that it would arrive with such cinematic precision. Evelyn's filings had reached the press sooner than expected, leaked not by us, but by those he had once trusted. The story had legs now, and they were running fast. He laughed, brittle and unconvincing. "This is absurd," he said. "A smear campaign." But someone in the crowd shouted, "Then why did your board vote to suspend you?" The question drew murmurs and a few scattered claps. Even his partner's hand slipped from his arm. I watched every micro-expression: denial, anger, calculation, fear. He glanced at me across the room, and for a brief second I saw recognition. The awareness that the collapse wasn't random, that this was the price of his own excesses. The symmetry of it was perfect. The same public theater where he'd once paraded his triumphs now turned on him, spotlight and all. He tried to regain control. "My legal team will address this immediately," he said, but his voice trembled. The room smelled faintly of panic, too many people pretending not to watch, too many smiles curdling at the edges. A socialite whispered near me, "He's finished," and I realized the narrative had shifted beyond repair. Later, as he stormed toward the exit, reporters followed, microphones flashing. His partner trailed behind, her expression tight, eyes darting for an escape route. The crowd parted not out of respect but avoidance. He passed me on his way out, close enough for me to smell his cologne. Familiar, expensive, and now tainted by sweat. "Did you do this?" he hissed under his breath. I looked at him calmly. "No," I said. "You did." The words hung between us, quiet but final. His face tightened, the kind of realization that comes too late to stop the unraveling. When he disappeared into the flashing lights and noise outside, I turned back toward the ballroom. Conversations resumed, cautious but electric. A few people approached me with polite sympathy. Others simply nodded, the subtle acknowledgement of power shifting hands. I smiled, but it wasn't triumph. It was closure. As the orchestra resumed, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in years. Justice hadn't come with fury or spectacle. It had arrived as truth, uncoiling in public where lies once lived. Watching him walk away, reputation crumbling under the same spotlight he craved, I finally understood what Evelyn meant. Gravity does the work for you. The catharsis wasn't in his humiliation. It was in reclaiming peace. The balance had corrected itself, and for the first time, I didn't need to fight. I just needed to let it fall. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded, the headlines moved on, the whispers softened, and life, as it always does, began to settle. I spent my mornings walking through the quiet streets of Greenwich, the same ones that had once made me feel invisible. Now they felt different, not because the world had changed, but because I had. The woman who once stood trembling in the shadows of betrayal had evolved into someone sharper, steadier, and strangely serene. Heartbreak had been my teacher. In its rawest form, it had stripped me bare, of illusions, dependence, and the exhausting need to please. The pain that once felt unbearable had forged a kind of clarity I never knew I was capable of. I no longer replayed that night at the first gala. Instead, I thought of the moment I chose to stop being a spectator in my own life. That decision, quiet and defiant, was the real turning point. Strategy followed pain like instinct. Every step I took, the research, the planning, the alliances, was born not from vengeance, but from the desire to reclaim my narrative. I learned to navigate systems that once intimidated me, to read contracts like confessions, and to see opportunity where others saw ruin. My confidence didn't roar. It whispered, steady and unwavering. I had become fluent in restraint, in precision, in power that didn't need to announce itself, and triumph. Well, it didn't arrive with the grandeur I once imagined. It came quietly, on an ordinary morning, when I looked at my reflection and no longer saw loss. The scars were still there, yes, but they had become proof of endurance, not reminders of defeat. For the first time, I admired the woman staring back, her composure, her intelligence, her refusal to be defined by what had been taken from her. I realized that revenge, in the end, had never been the goal. Justice was only part of it. What truly mattered was rediscovering my worth, my independence, my peace. Power, I learned, isn't in control. It's in detachment. It's in the ability to walk away with dignity, while the world expects you to shatter. At night, I often met Evelyn and Thomas for dinner. We spoke less of strategy now, more of beginnings, new ventures, investments, the possibilities ahead. "You've done more than win," Evelyn once said with a knowing smile. "You've transformed." As I sipped my wine, watching the city lights shimmer beyond the glass, I understood what she meant. My story was no longer about him, or the loss, or even the revenge. It was about evolution, about the quiet, persistent strength that grows when everything you built burns, and you decide to rebuild differently. The audience, if they had followed me from heartbreak to this moment, would see not a woman scorned, but a woman reborn, calm, confident, and free. The arc had closed, not with rage, but with grace. And as I stepped into the crisp night air, a final thought settled over me. The greatest revenge is not destruction, it's transformation. When the dust finally settled, I took stock of what was left. The numbers were easy to tally. Accounts balanced, assets secured, reputation restored. But the real inventory lived deeper. I had lost a marriage, yes, but what I truly shed was the illusion that love alone could sustain respect. I had once built my life around someone else's ambitions, measuring my worth in his approval. That blindness cost me years I'll never reclaim. Yet in losing him, I gained something I never thought I'd find: myself. Independence wasn't loud or glamorous. It was quiet mornings with coffee and peace, decisions made without apology, silence that didn't ache anymore. I learned that dignity has a different kind of currency, one that no betrayal can devalue. Pain taught me discipline. Betrayal taught me discernment. Power taught me restraint. And forgiveness, well, forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about freeing myself from the weight of resentment that once shadowed every thought. If I could speak to the woman I was that night at the gala, I'd tell her this: you will lose more than you imagined, but you'll gain more than you dared to hope. The heartbreak will refine you, not ruin you. The humiliation will pass, and in its place, self-respect will bloom, quietly, unshakably. As I close this chapter, I don't feel triumph so much as understanding. Revenge gave me justice, but wisdom gave me peace. Life will always have its betrayals, but I now know that survival isn't about winning battles. It's about knowing when you no longer need to fight. I walked away not as the woman who was left behind, but as the woman who moved forward. It's strange how quiet true peace can be. Months have passed since that night when everything changed, and now my days feel lighter, measured not by revenge or validation, but by a steady sense of control. I live in a small house overlooking the water, nothing extravagant, but it's mine. Every detail. The worn oak table, the soft hum of the kettle, the scent of sea air feels earned. There's no one to perform for anymore, no mask to wear, just me, whole and unafraid. Sometimes I hear about my ex-husband through whispers in Greenwich society. His perfect life with the millionaire isn't quite so perfect anymore. The lavish business deals have soured. His charm is now seen as recklessness. I don't gloat when I hear it, but I won't pretend it doesn't feel like balance finding its way home. Karma doesn't rush, but it always arrives. I've invested quietly, built something solid with the people who stood by me when no one else did. My company has grown, not through spectacle but integrity. Clients trust me, not my last name. That's the sweetest success, to be valued for substance, not association. Evelyn jokes that I've become too serene, that I need new chaos to conquer. But I've had my share of storms. Now I'm learning to savor calm. Every so often, I drive past the grand venues where I once stood humiliated, my heart breaking behind practiced smiles. I don't feel bitterness anymore, just distance, the kind that time and healing carve out like gentle rivers through stone. Those places no longer hold power over me. They're just backdrops to a story that made me stronger. In quiet moments, I think about how everything I once feared losing, love, status, belonging, was never mine in the first place. What's real can't be taken. What's fragile isn't worth holding. That truth, earned through heartbreak and fire, is my freedom. As the sun sets over the harbor, I stand on my porch with a glass of wine, the same color as those gala lights once reflected in my tears. This time I smile. I'm not defined by what happened to me, but by how I rose from it. And if the world ever underestimates me again, I'll let it. There's quiet power in being underestimated, because by the time they notice, it's already too late. The chapter closes not with vengeance, but with peace. And that, I've learned, is the most beautiful kind of justice.